Welcome to Mount Elliott Cemetery, the oldest surviving cemetery within the city limits of Detroit, Michigan. 65 acres of history, heritage, and quiet dignity consecrated over 180 years ago. When the nation was young, Michigan was brand new, and Detroit was still finding its footing. Here's its story. Mount Elliott Cemetery sits at 1701 Mount Elliott Avenue, just north of Lafayette Street on Detroit's east side. It spans 65 acres of carefully tended landscape. Its roads are winding beneath old trees, past family monuments, mausoleums, and the graves of soldiers, mayors, merchants, pioneers, and ordinary Detroiters who lived extraordinarily. The cemetery is part of what is now known as the East Side Historic Cemetery District. This is an incredible stretch of land that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was placed there in 1982. Within this district, there are 3 historic cemeteries that are side by side. We have Mount Elliott, which is the Catholic cemetery established in 1841 that we're discussing now, Elmwood Cemetery, the non-denominational Protestant cemetery that was established in 1846, and the Lafayette Street Cemetery, which is Michigan's oldest Jewish cemetery, established in 1850. Together, they form an incredible concentration of historic burial grounds, one unlike any other that you will see in the Midwest, and Mount Elliott is the oldest of the 3. To understand how Mount Elliott Cemetery came to be, you have to understand the Detroit of the early 1800s. So we had wave after wave of immigrants that had been pouring into the city, French settlers, British arrivals, and by the 1830s and 1840s, a growing number of Irish Catholic. When Detroit's Irish Catholics first arrived, they worshipped at St. Anne Church, the city's longtime French-speaking parish. But as their numbers grew, they established their own congregation, Trinity Church, situated on the northwest corner of Cadillac Square and Bates Street. Trinity Church held the distinction of being the first English-speaking Catholic church in what were then the Western states. By 1840, the congregation had grown large enough that they needed their own burial ground. Trinity Church member Judge Robert Thomas Elliott, described as probably Detroit's first educated architect, was authorized by Father Baden to purchase land for a Catholic cemetery dedicated to the Irish parish. Elliott found his site on the north side of Jefferson Avenue on land that had belonged to a prominent local judge named John L. Lee. Elliott, along with Thomas Gallagher and Daniel Corby, negotiated the purchase of 11.5 acres for $400. Yes, $400. The deed was conveyed on August 31st, 1841 to Bishop Reese, the first Catholic bishop of Detroit, for a cemetery to be used exclusively by the Irish Catholic parish. The cemetery was consecrated in 1841. It was just 4 years after Michigan became the 26th state in the Union. And fun fact, Detroit was our first capital. And then in a twist that would give the cemetery its name forever, Robert Thomas Elliott, the man who had made it all possible, was killed in a construction accident at the site of St. Mary's Church on September 10th, 1841. He died just 12 days after the land was dedicated. He was the very first person interred at the cemetery. In his memory, the grounds were named Mount Elliott Cemetery. In the decades that followed, the cemetery grew alongside Detroit itself, just like we saw with the Mount Elliott Cemetery Corporation. Was formally organized on February 23, 1864, and it was incorporated the following year. It was placed under the care of 12 trustees representing all of the major Catholic parishes of Detroit, 2 each from Holy Trinity, SS Peter and Paul, St. Anne, St. Mary, St. Joseph, and St. Patrick. The cemetery expanded as well. A second parcel of land was purchased in December of 1865 and a third in October of 1881, which brought it to the total it is today, which is 65 acres. In the fall of 1869, 1,490 graves were relocated from Detroit's old city cemetery on Beaubien Farm and reinterred at Mount Elliott. Among them, there were soldiers, community leaders, and some of Detroit's earliest French settlers. And that same year, remains from the old St. Anne Cemetery were brought here as well, including the body of Colonel Jean-Francois Hamtramck, the American Revolutionary War officer after whom the city of Hamtramck is named. He was eventually reinterred a third and final time in 1962 at Veterans Memorial Park in the city, bearing his name. In 1882, the iconic stone gateway to the cemetery was completed by architect Walter Schweizkart at a cost of $6,000. Interestingly, Schweizkart also designed the stone arch and Interestingly, the internal roads of Mount Elliott carry deeply Catholic names: Pope Pius Avenue, Bishop Favre Avenue, Bishop Borges Avenue, alongside biblical themes: Calvary Avenue, Holy Cross Place, Trinity Avenue, and Resurrection Avenue. Walking through the grounds even today, the names themselves kind of come off like you're repeating a prayer. One of the most common questions about these two cemeteries is, which one came first? The answer is Mount Elliott, and it isn't particularly close. Mount Elliott was consecrated in 1841. Elmwood Cemetery, which is directly to the west, wasn't planned until 1846, and the first 42 acres weren't formally purchased until 1850. In fact, the connection between the two properties runs even deeper than their geography. The land for Elmwood Cemetery was purchased from George Hunt, whose family's farm abutted the very same Lieb farm from which Mount Elliott's land was bought. Lieb's daughter had married the brother of George Hunt. The two cemeteries are not just neighbors in space, they are also neighbors in history. Today, if you were to go to either cemetery, you could see that they are both extremely close together. The only thing that separates them is a fence, and you can see that from either cemetery. And while Elmwood went on to become the city's preeminent non-denominational cemetery, which is home to 29 mayors, governors, senators, and the famous Veiled Lady sculpture, Mount Elliott carved out its own irreplaceable role as the spiritual home of Detroit's Catholic immigrant communities. From its very founding, Mount Elliott Cemetery has been a Catholic institution, and that identity is woven into every corner of the ground. The cemetery is born from the needs of an Irish Catholic community that wanted a place of their own, rooted in their faith. And as Detroit grew and diversified through the 19th century, so did the population of Mount Elliott. French families, German immigrants, Irish settlers all found their final resting place here, side by side, united by their Catholic faith. The tombstones at Mount Elliott reflect the family names that built Detroit: Shane, Beaubien, Caniff, Moran, Morose. These are all names that are still found on Detroit buildings and streets and neighborhoods. The monuments that mark their graves are handcrafted in marble and granite and zinc. They are works of art in their own right. The cemetery is also notable for its Fireman's Plot, a special section established in 1872 when the Fireman's Fund purchased large lots here and at Elmwood to provide a dignified burial for paid firefighters who died in the line of duty. The Fireman's Fund monument at Mount Elliott, completed in 1890, cost $2,965, and it still stands today. Memorial Day services are held here every year in their honor. Additionally, the cemetery contains military burials spanning generations, from veterans of the War of 1812 to soldiers who served in Napoleon's army, Civil War veterans, and even Medal of Honor recipients. The cemetery has been operated since its earliest decades by the Mount Elliott Cemetery Association. It's a nonprofit Catholic organization that today also operates Mount Olivet, Resurrection, All Saints, and Guardian Angel cemeteries across the Metro Detroit area. Of course, no history of Mount Elliott Cemetery would be complete without the remarkable people who rest within its gates. Jerome Kavanaugh, who was elected Detroit's mayor in 1962 at the young age of 33, making him the youngest mayor in the city's history at that time, is buried here. He was a nationally known figure in urban politics, a friend of President Kennedy's and Johnson, and the mayor who marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the landmark June 1963 Freedom March on Woodward Avenue. He secured over $42 million in federal poverty program funds for Detroit, and his funeral was one of the largest in Detroit history. Barnabas Campo, brother of the legendary Joseph Campo, one of the wealthiest men in Michigan history, is also buried here. He purchased Belle Isle, Detroit's famous island park, in 1817 for $5,000. His heirs later sold it to the city of Detroit for $200,000 in 1879. And of course, it's a Detroit landmark to this day. Louis Antoine Beaubien, a French pioneer whose farm helped shape the very geography of early Detroit, also rests in Mount Beaubien Street, one of the city's major thoroughfares, is named for his family. Is Rosa Parks buried? She's at Woodlawn. Jeremiah Dwyer, the founder of the Michigan Stove Company, which was once the largest stove manufacturing plant in the world, is buried in Mount Elliott, along with multiple generations of his family. The Dwyer's family stove manufacturing empire helped make Detroit an industrial powerhouse in the 19th century. Perhaps one of the most unique graves belongs to Alfred J. Chevrolet, the son of Louis Chevrolet, the founder of the Chevrolet automobile brand and famous racing driver. Alfred, unlike his father, lived quietly and without fanfare, working on the assembly line and eating from a lunchbox. He never told his coworkers who his father was, and he lived, as the records say, a simple but happy life. He's buried here alongside his mother, Suzanne, the wife of Louis Chevrolet. And finally, just across the street from the cemetery's gates lies one of the most spiritually significant figures connected to Mount Elliott, Blessed Casey. Born Bernard Francis Casey in 1875, Father Solanus was a Capuchin friar who served at St. Bonaventure Monastery, located directly across the cemetery from 1924 to 1946. He was known as a wonder worker and devoted his life to caring for the sick and the poor and greeting thousands of visitors at the monastery door and offering prayer and counsel. He died in Detroit in 1957, and in 1995, Pope John Paul II elevated him to venerable. And in 2017, Pope Francis announced and confirmed a miracle and elevated him to blessed, a title just one step below sainthood. His remains are enshrined at the Solanus Casey Center, visited by over 100,000 pilgrims every year. The Mount Elliott Cemetery Association has recognized this deep connection by commissioning a statue of Blessed Solanus on the grounds facing the monastery where he served. Today, Mount Elliott Cemetery remains very much a living institution. It's part of the East Side Historic Cemetery District that I mentioned earlier, and of course on the National Register of Historic Places. In 2025, it was honored as a runner-up in the American Cemetery Excellence Awards. It was recognized for its beauty and historical significance, and of course its ties to Blessed Solanus Casey. The grounds are meticulously maintained. Its historic stone gateway still stands as it has since 1882. And the cemetery continues to serve the greater Detroit community as a place of burial, reflection, and remembrance, just as it has for more than 180 years. If you want to take a tour, Preservation Detroit offers historic tours of the cemetery each October, giving visitors the chance to walk the grounds and hear the stories of the remarkable Detroiters buried within, or you can just drive over there and give yourself a self-guided tour. One of the things we've learned through this cemetery series I've been working on is that a cemetery at its best is not just a place for the dead. It is a record, a physical, enduring record of a city's story, and few places in Detroit tell that story as few. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you want to see more of Detroit history, cemetery tours, and of course, cool things to do in the city. Cheers.